I am a Yank in Sussex, and this is Devil's Dyke. This dry valley, about 4 miles northwest of Brighton, at the edge of the chalk of the South Downs in West Sussex, is the deepest such valley in the United Kingdom. When I first came to Sussex and my British bride took me out to see the Dyke for the first time, I was a little puzzled at the name, since it's obviously a valley, not a dike. But I just accepted this oddity at the time. After all, there was a village near our house called Small Dole, but strangely enough there was no village nearby called Large Dole, or just plain Dole, so why would Small Dole need to be called Small, if it were the only one? And then there was the village of West Itchenor, but no corresponding village of East Itchenor, and West Itchenor is actually north of Itchenor. So if we're going to have that, why not a dike that was actually a valley? Well, there's more to this, as I discovered later. In fact, the actual Devil's Dyke was hidden right in plain sight, right next to this valley. I'll get to this in a bit. But first, how did this valley come to be? Like a lot of old things in Britain, there's a story behind it. Of course, the origin myth of the Devil's Dyke, of which there are a number of versions, revolves around the devil. This myth plays to the devil's desire to do away with the religious fervor of the people of the Sussex Weald, which lies behind the Chalk Downs, by flooding the churches using the waters of the English Channel, because obviously the devil doesn't like churches. So he tried to dig a valley from the Weald to the Channel to let the water in. Or so the legend goes. Let's hear what the British bride has to say about it.
Wendy, the tour director. So,
this is the actual dike part of Devil's Dyke, and if you look hard enough you can see the shovel marks where he was digging to let the sea drown the Sussex Weald. But there's cows now taking advantage of the lush pasture.
so why do they call this Devil's Dyke again?
Because it's said that the devil wanted to flood the Sussex Weald Valley over that way, and he came and dug a trench towards the sea, which is that way, and a lady came out of her cottage with a lantern, and a cockerel thought it was dawn coming and crowed, and the devil thought it was morning and went running off with his job unfinished. Bit of a stupid devil, if you ask me.
Yes.
He could have just blown the candle out and chopped the cockerel's head off.
Yes.
That bothered.
No doubt should have.
So thus his work was never done, and the Sussex Weald lives on. And he's got some very pretty villages.
Yeah, we got some cows down there taking advantage of the lush vegetation, as you were saying earlier. Lovely.
It turns out that science does not endorse this view of how the dry valley of the Dyke was created. The straight scoop is this. The Devil's Dyke is called a dry valley because there is no stream of water that flows down it even during wet seasons. Or at least this is the case today. But more than 14,000 years ago, because there was an ice age going on, the area experienced an intensely cold climate, but not glaciers this far south, contrary to what some have believed. This valley is a result of what is called solifluction and river erosion. Solifluction is a collective name for the gradual sloughing of surface materials down a slope due to freeze-thaw activity. During the last glaciation, snowfields capped the topsoil of the South Downs. The permafrost conditions meant that the underlying chalk was permanently frozen, but the upper layers of chalk and soil were not. In summer, when the snowfields melted and saturated the top layer of soil, because the water couldn't penetrate the frozen chalk underneath, waterlogged material situated above the permafrost slid down the gradient, removing material both by friction and water flow, exposing deeper layers of frozen chalk. This is what solifluction looks like. You can see the marks of solifluction along the sides of the dike and other dry valleys at the edge of these chalk downs. When the last ice age ended, the snowfields covering the South Downs melted, and rivers formed across Sussex. The Devil's Dyke Valley was completed by one such river. As I said earlier, the Devil's Dyke is the steepest such dry valley in Great Britain, being 300 feet from bottom to top at its steepest point. Note that the South Downs has quite a number of other similar dry valleys, such as this one, called Anchor Bottom, about 3.5 miles west of Devil's Dyke. It opens out into the valley of the River Ader and is used for grazing cattle. Anchor Bottom has a similar shape and length to Devil's Dyke, but it is not at all as dramatic or as deep. But it was formed by the same process that formed the dike. Let's have a nice long look down the dike towards that dome-shaped landform where the dike turns northwards towards the village of Poynings. In the distance you can see the buildings of Saddlescombe Farm, a farming hamlet mentioned in the Doomsday Book nearly 1,000 years ago. Here on the ridge you can see the Devil's Dyke Inn and Pub. Now the steepness of the dike here kind of reminds me of a scene from that wonderful film, The Princess Bride.
You can die too for all I care.
Oh. As you wish.
Oh, my sweet Wesley, what have I done? Ow! Oh!
Ooh. Ooh. Ooh.
Well, you don't want to do that. It could be very painful, even here where it's not quite so steep or quite so deep. And no fire swamp either. Because of its distinctive size and shape, Devil's Dyke has been a magnet for visitors for many years. The first hotel here was constructed in 1817. In Victorian times, that means during the reign of Queen Victoria, they laid railroad tracks from Brighton out to the dike, with the branch line opening in 1887. The railway took visitors from Portslade Station near Brighton to Devil's Dyke Station, a trip of about 3 miles. The 1893 August bank holiday saw about 30,000 people flock to the dike, many of them brought by the railway. This railway line was operated up until around 1938, when competition from bus lines made it uneconomical to operate. There was another way up to the dike, and that was to arrive at the foot of the escarpment by whatever means you came, near Poynings Village, where a steep-grade railway could take you to the top of the escarpment. Here's what that railhead at the top of the escarpment looks like today, just a remnant. And a modern aerial photo showing the path of the funicular railway going between the top of the hill fort and the village of Poynings below. And the dike was quite an amusement park. Among other things, they built 2 bandstands, an observatory, a camera obscura, and various fairground rides, turning the dike into a kind of Victorian Disneyland. Besides the funicular railway and a cable car, they also had carnival rides, very similar to what we enjoy today. This is from a very early movie taken at the dike, showing turn of the 19th century folks, enjoying such things as merry-go-rounds, roller coasters, and Ferris wheels. Here's a photo taken of the dike itself, taken from the head of the valley, looking towards Saddlescombe. This photo was marked with the year, 1910. I found this online and thought it was a good image of what the dike looked like 100 years ago. A closer look at the old photo reveals something unexpected, at least to me. At first I hadn't taken particular notice of the 2 towers on either side of the valley, but then recalled that I once stood on an old concrete footing on the south side of the dike and wondered what it was for. And then it hit me. This was a footing for a support of some kind for the tower you see here on the right. And there must have been a matching footing on the other side. The footing pertaining to the left side tower appears not to have been so well preserved. It's no longer much in evidence on the ground. Now, if you look at this photo even more closely, you can see what looks to be cables strung between the towers. And there's an odd shape hovering over the middle of the valley. Kind of looks like it's in the distance, as if it were associated with the cables. Was this a kind of gondola that might have taken visitors on a trip across the valley? Looks like it, and indeed it was. It turns out that Britain's first cable car was built here in 1894. It was a great sightseeing attraction for Victorians eager to try anything new. The cable car took them on a 300-meter ride across the valley, and at a time when airplanes had yet to be invented, this airborne ride was probably quite a thrill. These could apparently hold up to 8 persons for a ride across the valley of the dike. Here's a retouched and colorized photo making the cables between the towers more evident. All that remains today are the concrete foundations which supported the towers. The modern Victorians weren't the only ones to see the value of Devil's Dyke as a place of entertainment. The Victorian amusements are now long gone, but we moderns have found other things to do at the Dyke. There are plenty of trails that walking enthusiasts can follow, as well as a nice inn and pub. The British Bride and I have eaten a few times at the pub, and the food is quite acceptable. In addition to walking the various trails, these days there is flying to do at the Dyke. It's almost always windy here, and it turns out to be a great place to launch hang and paragliders from. This has been going on since the early 1970s. Earlier I mentioned that what usually comes to mind with the word dike is a berm and ditch constructed by humans. A nature-made valley just doesn't seem to qualify. Consider the Netherlands. When we think of a dike that protects the lowland in the Netherlands from the sea, we're not envisioning a valley, are we? And with this thought, note that this isn't the only Devil's Dyke here in the UK. There are actually two other structures called Devil's Dyke, one in Cambridgeshire and the other in Hertfordshire. Both of these others were made by humans, and they both consist of a raised berm of dirt or earth next to the ditch from which the berm's material was dug. And both of them were constructed for purposes of defense, although in these two cases they are line defenses. The one in Hertfordshire is only about a third of a mile long, but the one in Cambridgeshire stretches for 7 miles. And so I bring your attention to the Iron Age hill fort at the Devil's Dyke in Sussex, and why this is called Devil's Dyke, just like those other two Devil's Dykes. Looking down from orbit, we can see the outline of the hill fort's defensive rampart. I'm attempting here to follow the line of the circumvallate ditch, and in total this ditch and berm is about 1¼ miles around. If you were to assume that the rampart and ditch were pretty much the same all the way around the fort, however, you'd be wrong. Along the southeastish portion, which faces the dry valley, here indicated in light blue, the berm and ditch are hardly visible at all now, almost non-existent. Along the northeast and north side, here in green, the rampart is quite definite, but the most pronounced part of the rampart is the portion facing more or less level ground, here indicated in red. I'm calling these three different strengths of fortifications light, medium, and heavy. Logically enough, the heavy defense faces where any attacker has the best advantage, across the level ground to the southwest. Also logically, the medium defense faces attackers who have to climb a considerably long and steep slope, and will be exhausted by the time they reach the defenders. But what about the light defense? The climb from the bottom of the dry valley is not anywhere near as arduous as that facing the medium defense, so why is a fortification so light here? I think the answer to that one is the nature of the valley itself. Attackers moving down into the valley from the opposite side are going to be at a supreme disadvantage. They would have to pay attention to their footing, going downhill into the valley, while they would be facing upright in full view of defenders wielding projectile weapons such as spears, arrows, and slings. And if their attack is failing, retreat will be uphill, and in perfect position for retaliation by the defenders. In short, attack across the valley would not be likely. An alternate attack route that takes advantage of the light fortification here would be movement up the valley of the dike from the Weald, and then up the slope. But the problem could be worse, since they will have been exposed to projectile weapons on their right flank. We call that enfilade or flanking fire, by the way, along the whole way. So they're no more likely to try that. Any reasonable attacker is going to be forced to attack across the level ground, where the fortifications are the heaviest. That's my assessment, at least. Here's a view of the eastern end of the hill fort, where you can see how the medium defense stacks up as the view shifts, and facing the dry valley, how there seems to be no defensive berm at all. I do expect that originally there was a defensive berm and ditch, even if minimal, but thousands of years of solifluction and erosion would have eliminated most of it. In the distance, you can see a copse of trees, behind which the inn and pub can be seen, and you'll see what looks like a number of parasails inflated by the wind. When I say this is an Iron Age hill fort, this means it was built long before the Romans came to Britain. In fact, well before the Iron Age came to Great Britain, making this structure possibly as old as 3,000 years. And now let's turn from the chalk downs and have a look at the Sussex Weald. Directly in front of us here, you can see the village of Poynings, population around 450. It's a pretty little village with an historic Anglican church, the Holy Trinity Church, and a fine pub called the Royal Oak. Poynings is one of the villages that is found along what is called a spring line, which you're seeing as you look up the escarpment in the distance. These villages were sited here because the rainwater falling on the downs would permeate into the chalk escarpment, but not the underlying impermeable rock, so the water would emerge at the base of the escarpment as very reliable springs. The other villages along this particular line of springs westward of Pointings are Folking and Edburton. This is a very interesting place to visit, especially when the hang gliding and parasailing enthusiasts are in the air, which is frequently. If you're in the area, you should drop in and have a look. This has been a production of A Yank in Sussex, and thanks for watching this video to its end. If you found it interesting, please click like and hit the subscribe button. For instant notification of new videos, hit the bell icon. And you have yourself a wonderful day.